We're all very human and fallible, and yet we live in a society that rewards pretending we're not fallible, or the range of acceptable fallibility is narrow.
We are constantly comparing our insides to other people's outsides and feeling inadequate and guilty, even ashamed.
Trying to blend in means parts of ourselves must disappear, and we must then live in fear that we will be found out.
Here, together, we will create a space where we can laugh, cry, and carry our suffering and hurts lightly.
In the service of being deeply human.
This is Life's Dirty Little Secrets.
Welcome to Life's Dirty Little Secrets. I'm Emma Waddington.
And I'm Chris McCurry. And today we are honored and delighted to have as our guest Dr. Jonathan Caspi. He is a full-time professor and inaugural director of the PhD in Family Studies program at Montclair State University. He received his MSW in 1992 from Hunter College in New York City and his PhD in 1997 from the State University of New York at Albany. Dr. Caspi is an internationally recognized sibling expert, author, speaker, and family therapist. He maintains a small therapy practice with offices in Montclair and Hazlet, New Jersey. He's the author of Sibling Aggression, Assessment and Treatment, as well as Sibling Development, Implications for Mental Health Practitioners. Please welcome Dr. John Caspi.
Honored to be here. Thank you for having me.
No, you're very welcome. Thank you for being here. So today's topic is siblings, and maybe we should start with some disclosure about our own backgrounds. I'll start. I was one of six siblings in my family. My brother and I were in the middle, 2 older sisters, 2 younger sisters. And I'm sure that their influence is deep and wide and long-lasting in my life, and it'll be interesting to talk about that today.
Absolutely. You are who you are because of your siblings. Or if you're an only child, the lack of siblings. Are you the first brother or the second?
I'm the second brother. The 4 oldest in my family are all 18 months apart. Bam, bam, bam. My mother was 26 when I was born. She said youth and ignorance got her through. And then there's a 6.5-year gap between me and my next sibling, and then a couple years for the last one to arrive. So yeah, it's my understanding that a lot of middle children become therapists.
A literature about middleborns being more mediators because they grow up in the middle, right? So they learn how to sort of navigate that terrain. And also, if you have older sisters, you tend to be a little softer, more empathic, and not so aggressive.
Well, my wife credits my older sisters for some of my better qualities.
And who does she credit your bad qualities to?
Me entirely.
Yes, right.
Yeah, I've got 2 sisters. I'm the eldest. So I have my second sister is 2 and 3/4 years younger than me. And then I have a younger sister who's 10 years younger than me. And so it's very interesting, the difference in the relationship between my youngest sister and my middle sister.
In what way is it interesting?
Well, because I remember when my younger sister came, it felt like a different life. Like I'd had such 10 years with one sibling. And then when she came, I felt much more maternal. I mean, I remember when she was born, feeling besotted. Like she was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen and felt very motherly. I mean, I remember, adoring my middle sister, but it was a different kind of dynamic to my youngest sister. My youngest sister just felt much younger and much more vulnerable. And we never had the arguments that I had with my middle sister, inevitably. It was just different dynamic.
Yeah, that is really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
And did that mean that sometimes you had to protect your youngest sister from your middle sister?
I know. I was just thinking about the whole protection thing. And I felt very protective of both, actually. I think my middle sister probably didn't want me to protect her. I felt very protective and she didn't think she needed it. I think it was easier to be protective of my little sister. She let me protect her. My middle one didn't really. Yeah, it was just different. But I felt very protective of both. But their dynamic was different. Like they had proper arguments. I didn't have proper arguments with my little sister.
Yeah, that is very interesting. I had a question for you now. Oh, are you more similar to the baby sister than you are to the middle?
What a good question. I don't know. So I was thinking about careers because my middle sister went into law. I'm obviously a psychologist. And then my little sister went into nursing. In fact, she was on one of our podcasts. We talked to her about moral injury. What am I more like? Yeah, maybe. I don't know. We're very different, all three of us, actually. But I don't know if we're different because we moved a lot. So we grew up in different countries, as in we had formative years in different countries. And I'm often curious as to the influence that had, like the culture we grew up in addition to obviously our family. Yeah, so we're quite different.
Well, that fits the literature nicely too. I can't speak to growing up in different countries, although I think you're absolutely correct. There's no way that could not have influenced difference. But the interesting thing is, in 1990, a research study came out, and it was called "Why Are Siblings So Different?" Because a geneticist, the guy that was studying genetics, did this research, and found out that siblings are as different on personality and psychological adjustment tests. And when we say psychological adjustment, we mean anxiety and depression and those kind of things, as random pairs of strangers on the street. So, if you take two people off the street and you test them for personality and psychological adjustment, and then you take two siblings that grew up with each other in the same house, they're as different from each other. And when I first read that, I was like, there's no way. That's crazy because, when you grow up with siblings, you typically have the same parents and you grow up in the same house and you eat the same food and you go to the same schools and you are exposed to the same, whether or not your parents are happy or depressed or, drinking or not. And there's all this same, not to mention that genetics make us more similar. So how in the world can random pairs of strangers be as similar as siblings? And they sort of left it at the end of the study, like somebody else can figure out why. Here's just kind of the information. And it turns out, at least from my take on things, and I'm not the only one, that it's because of your siblings. Not only do we try to be different from our siblings, but, our parents see us as different. We do grow up in different environments. We're different ages. It's so much, firstborn parents are so much different than lastborn parents. There's a whole host of reasons why we're so different. But a lot of it has to do with who our siblings are and how we're positioned, next to them.
That is so interesting because you assume that you're similar to your siblings. And I always thought with my family, my parents are incredibly different. So I always thought, well, it's the mix of genes has got to be, quite fundamental to how different my siblings and I are. But yeah, you're absolutely right. And we're actually speaking to Emily Edlin later on in the month to talk about the influence of parenting on children and behavior, and how much is parenting and how much is sort of nature.
Yeah, there's some compelling research out there that sort of suggests that parents aren't anywhere near as influential as they believe they are. I just want to kind of add to that discussion we just had that we're talking about psychological adjustment and personality, but you can be similar in so many other ways, like your sense of humor, your appearance, your preference for things, there's lots of other things that define humans other than psychological adjustment. And personality is the concept that it's not as controversial as it should be. Once you get into studying siblings, you start to wonder about this whole personality piece because of how siblings change each other so much and define our identities.
Oh, could you expand on that? That's really interesting.
Yeah, sure. So once you label a child and give them a title, whether it's outgoing or sloppy or silly or any of those kind of things. What you have implied for another sibling is the exact opposite, because you can't refer to somebody as silly without referring to somebody else as serious within their comparative environment. You can't have somebody be outgoing unless somebody else is quiet in response. And I kind of do this like, I don't know what you call it, almost like a cocktail party game with my students, in which I say, what do your parents label you? And they give me 3 or 4 labels. And then I go, okay, so your brother or your sister is this, this, and this. And you nail it almost every time, because this sort of implied opposite always exists. And that, in lots of ways, it's pretty benign, but in some ways it can be pretty bad. Like, I've actually had people come up to me and say, this is my smart one. And the other one is not usually so not smart that they haven't heard what just happened. Right. But then that label becomes internalized, and it starts to define your whole sense of self. And you start to think, well, I'm not smart. And maybe that's only because you have a really gifted academic brother or sister. Now, if you didn't have an academic brother or sister, maybe you would be the smart one. Right. And so all of a sudden it gets flipped on its head about who is. Another example I like to give is, Michael Jordan, who's often considered to be like the greatest athlete ever, had a brother who, was a very good basketball player and played professionally in Europe, I believe. But nobody ever hears about that.
Wow.
And if he didn't have Michael as his brother, he would be the athlete in the family. So it shifts depending on who's next to you.
And I guess it's part of this human nature that we can't help but compare. But is there something specific, something particular to siblings that makes that comparison so much more powerful?
Oh, that's a great question. Because not only siblings are compared more than any other relationship. I mean, you're compared even before, babies are born. Mothers will hold their stomachs and go, boy, this one kicks way more than the last one. This is going to be a feisty kid, right? And all of a sudden that and then when they come out, right away the comparisons start. You got your uncle's nose and you got your mom's eyes, but you're different from your brother or sister. And what parents do, and there's research that shows this, is they overemphasize the differences, because when you make comparisons, you typically compare in the direction of difference, not in the direction of similarity. And so that even makes those more profound. And so, what we learn when we're growing up is that siblings represent the barometer for whether or not we're performing well. Because, there's this, I don't know what you would call it, an illusion that we all grow up with the same resources and have the same opportunities and are treated the same way. And so therefore, if one is more successful than the other, then it somehow is something to do with us. And if we're more successful, then we feel pretty good about it. And there's actually research that shows that people who outperform their siblings economically score higher in happiness. And
wow.
Not necessarily your neighbors or your parents or your friends, although they matter. The siblings are such a powerful factor in that equation. And yet, we're not exposed to the same worlds. Again, our parents, even if they're the same biological parents, are so different, from family, from child to child. Firstborn parents are crazy people. They go to Lamaze classes and they read books like What to Expect When You're Expecting, and they come home from the hospital driving 20 miles an hour in the slow lane, and they go and they huddle down for like 6 months and they don't want anybody visiting. And by the time you get to like number 6, you're like,
I was eating off the floor and my parents didn't care. It's like
you're totally different parents. Firstborn parents are very nervous parents. They call the doctor the minute anybody coughs. And when you get to number 4, you could be up in a tree and they're like, yeah, if they fall, they'll learn that that's how you shouldn't climb trees. Yeah, it's such a different parent. So we that also influences how we how we see ourselves, and how we, whether or not we become rule abiding or not, and all those kind of things.
It's fascinating. I'm just thinking about how powerful siblings are in terms of shaping our personality and the way we are, in a way that I don't think I thought about prior to this conversation. And I was thinking also about this piece around comparison and how we're comparing, as siblings, we compare ourselves. What is the purpose of all this comparison that we do between ourselves as siblings? Is it because we are trying to get more affection and recognition from parents? Is that what the comparison is in the service of? Or is it in terms of our own identity? Why is there so much comparison? Why is it so much stronger in siblings, between siblings?
That's a good question, too. I think it'll take us into a little bit sort of a side direction. But one of the reasons I think siblings compare each other so much is because, the world compares them, and you learn very early. I mean, you do hear your parents and your teachers and your grandparents and your coaches and your neighbor, everybody's, it's a very common kind of thing. And the world sort of identifies siblings as special to compare to. I mean, even if you think about like professional athletes or actors who are siblings, there's, thousands of athletes and thousands of actors, but people are always like, I think he's a better quarterback, or I think, meanwhile, they're both at the top of their game. And so, I think there's a lot of pressure or social pressure for comparison. But the other piece that you brought up is this kind of vying for position in families and, winning resources. That is, if you can be in a better position, if you can position yourself in a way that's a more favorable comparison to your siblings, then your parents may treat you better. And, there's this book, maybe you've heard of it. It was called Born to Rebel by Frank Sulloway, which sort of changed the whole sibling discussion in around 1996. And he applied, evolutionary principles to family life and sibling life in particular, and explained that sibling fighting is really fighting over resources. Because if you look at it through an evolutionary lens, the more resources you have, more you can succeed in life, and the more mature you can be, and the more self-actualized, and all these kind of things. And so you'll be more appealing to a better mate. And, if you can find a better mate, then you have better offspring, right? And the whole idea is preservation of the genetic line and reproduction. That's the whole evolutionary model. So we see little kids fighting with each other for attention and, parental investment, because maybe we're wired that way to win most resources to get into a more favorable position. And at the same time, we don't want to win all of them because we want our siblings to do well. We have a genetic interest in them as well. But the evolutionary, I guess you would say, idea of fairness is I get 2 cookies and you get 1, right? It's 2-to-1. It's not 50-50, which is why when you cut the cake at a birthday party or you pour apple juice, and even if it's exactly the same, the siblings will find, he got more or she got more. And the reason why it's 2/3 is because we have 100% genetic interest in ourselves. That's 50 and 50. And then we have a 50% interest in our genetic interest in our siblings because we share about 50% novel genes with them. And so from that perspective, the comparison is a survival function and a preservation of the genetic line function. So I've kind of given you 2 ways to think about it. One is social constructivist kind of point of view, or social the social pressures of comparison, and then also this more genetic, being that we're wired in that direction. And you do see kids do that. Like if one kid comes up and says, "Look what I drew," the other kid right away is like, "Look what I drew." Right? There's this vying that happens a lot. And one of the dark sides of families, of course, is that sometimes siblings, instead of trying to win favor, try to learn how to disfavor their sibling by tattling and other kinds of things.
Well, that's that idea that in order for me to be up, you need to be down.
Right. My candle shines brighter when I blow yours out. Right.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. And I think of that as this sort of seesaw that in order for me to be up, you need to be down. And in my clinical practice working with families, I found that to be a great source of sibling conflict.
Mm.
But the families are also great laboratories for just some vicarious learning, where you'd watch your sibling do something and it didn't work out, and you think, well, I'm not going to do that. Or if it did work out, well, I'm going to try that myself, which may or may not work. But you're getting a lot of immediate feedback on good decisions versus bad decisions based on what's happening with your siblings.
Oh, 100%. Siblings watch each other very carefully. And what happens with siblings, which doesn't happen with only children, is that they get disciplined and praised with an audience, right? So the other siblings are paying very close attention to how it all goes down. And you're absolutely right. And it's so often that you find really rebellious troublemaker, say, firstborns, and then perfectionistic secondborns, because they've just been watching him. Like, I'm not doing any of that. I'm just just going to lay low over here and do everything right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But that's also, you're kind of getting us back to the sibling influence question in that way, because siblings make a lot of major life decisions based upon what their brothers and sisters do. If you have an older brother or sister who's very successful and you watched it, you're like, oh, that might be a good path for me. But if you see that they're struggling, you say, no, I'm not going to do it. But even more, I think, influential is the idea that siblings want to be different. Mm-hmm. There's a concept called de-identification and you start to see this young too. Like you go to the ice cream truck with your kids, and one says, "I want chocolate," and the other one says, "Well, I'm going to take vanilla then." And you're like, "But you love chocolate." And you're like, "Yeah, but now I want vanilla." Right? There's this purposefully trying to be different, and you see that in career choices. You see that in majors. You see that all over the place. That people make these, choosing sports that your siblings don't play, because maybe they're so successful in that you're just not going to compare well. And so you choose different, you choose differently. That's a huge area of influence for siblings.
Yeah, it's really interesting because I've got 3 children. My 2 eldest are huge football fans, and that's what we do most weekends. And my daughter is completely uninterested in football. And the boys want to get her into football and sort of trying to push her. And she's like, nope. Won't even kick a ball. Well, she will. That's not true. She will kick a ball. But they can't get her there. And I've often thought it's because the boys, they're great at football. It's their big thing. It's their thing. She doesn't want to be part of their thing. We have to figure out what her thing is, but...
That's 100% correct. You do have to find what her thing is, and she may not want for that reason. And I have a couple of questions for you now. But, first, how old are they? Just so I can have a feel for that.
13, 11, and 7.
Okay. And the 13 and the 11-year-old, they play different positions?
Yes.
Yeah. That's we call that within niche diversification. So even when you find people who are choosing the same thing as their sibling, they diversify within that thing. So with soccer, you get, football, you get with that different positions. You see that in sports, and like with music, you one will learn piano and the other will say, I want to take up drums, but they won't step into each other's territory. It's like my turf. That's my identity. And so, I'm a striker, I'm a defender, whatever, right? And that becomes part of their identity. And then there's, your daughter says, "Wow, there's a lot of pressure," right? Yeah,
yeah, totally. Yeah. She won't even watch the football. She won't even come to watch the football matches. Really?
Wow.
She's young still,
yeah.
But it is interesting because they were both very keen footballers from very young, and they play a lot of football together. And one's a goalie and one's a striker. So
perfect.
Yeah, perfect. So they really enjoy each other's sort of football company. But yeah, just to see how much she's pushing away from it, like not even remotely. Like it's a definite resounding no to football.
Well, so here's the thing, right? Like, if she were to choose to try it, what's the payoff, right?
Yeah.
Because if she's not a superstar right away,
Yeah.
she's going to feel like I'm just not good at this. And, my parents are more interested in my older siblings and how good they are at their thing. And I'm never going to be as good as them. I mean, that, it's a tall mountain to climb when you've got really talented older siblings. And if
Yeah.
she is a superstar right away, she may occupy that position. But it's a risky gambit. And so now if she chooses something else, then she gets your investment and your excitement, and you can connect over things that are unique to her, and she doesn't have to compete directly.
Totally.
Which is actually better for you.
Yeah, totally. Yes, I agree. It is really interesting. So I was thinking, going back to sort of, we're going in and out of conflict and identity, but I find the whole piece around sibling conflict so interesting and difficult at the same time, because as a parent, I find it incredibly difficult to witness conflict between my children. Especially if it gets physical, I find that very troubling. And it's really interesting because I'm one of three girls. My husband's one of three boys. And so his experience of conflict is very different to my experience of conflict growing up. My experience of conflict was much more verbal. His was much more physical. And so I find seeing my boys fight difficult, whilst, he doesn't. But perhaps if we had girls, he'd find, the girl fighting harder. But what are some of the sort of, how much should we be concerned with our children's conflict, and or even our own conflict? Because it is something that we carry on into life. Conflict that we've had with our siblings can keep going for the rest of our life. And so how much should we be concerned as parents, or how much is really normal and par for the course?
I just want to interject something that a while back I got frustrated with my son, and I called him my brother's name. So it just came out. And we were driving, and I just said, John.
Wow.
That's really interesting that you say that, because I haven't said it out loud, but I've had that experience many times of feeling like my oldest son and my brother, like it was a very similar feeling. Even when like my son was like 2, because I'm the older brother. It reminded me of like when I was with my brother when he was 2, and I was like, there is this weird parallel, which I don't think anybody's talked about or studied. So I think you're onto something with this sort of like, there's I don't even know what word to use other than like a vibe, like,
Well, there's circuitry that was formed decades ago that is just sitting there waiting to be reactivated. But I'm sure it startled him as much as it did me. But yeah,
probably more.
But
well, listen, I've called my kids the dog's name a bunch of times, but that I attribute to age. So yeah, back to conflict. You asked a very broad question, Emma. It's a good one, but man, it covers a lot of territory. Conflict in sibling fighting is, developmentally expected. It's you put any human beings in a shared space for a period of time, and there's going to be conflict, and so you would expect it. And it's a great place for kids to learn about, how to manage other people and how to engage in conflict and how to resolve it and, still be okay. And, all the kind of things that siblings teach us in a positive way, if conflict is handled in a constructive way. The physical part is problematic because, as you know, if kids are engaged in, punching, kicking, shoving, those kinds of things when they're little, they're going to likely continue that as a conflict management strategy when they get older, and all of a sudden they've bulked up and have got, they can really do some damage, and siblings do some serious damage to each other. The rates of folks who use aggressive physical, like punching and those kinds of things, with their siblings to solve fights is incredibly high. They range, believe it or not, in the research from 33% to like 98%. And when you ask college students, have you, used any physical, aggression to solve a fight, or when you were in a fight with a brother or sister within the past year, about 2/3 pretty consistently say that they have. And so there's a lot of it happening. And it's the only form of sanctioned physical violence. Nobody else can punch, kick, shove at a child, right? Parents can't do it in most states. Uncles and aunts can, grandparents, coaches, teachers, again, in most states. And I'm not sure in other places in the world it's probably more common that people use physical violence. But, here in the United States, siblings, you can punch a sibling and people often don't even blink an eye. And yeah, if you go to an emergency room and you say, my father pushed me down the stairs and that's why I have a broken arm, there's going to be a call to Child Protective Services. But if you say, my brother pushed me down the stairs, there's usually nothing that happens. It's conceptualized in a very different way. And so, we want to be careful about violence and normalizing things that we wouldn't in other relationships, because it does have long-term consequences.
Yeah.
There's an association between sibling destructive violence and abuse and date violence, and then domestic partner violence, and so on. And so, yeah, well, what I always recommend that parents do is to set a no violence rule very early, because violence is also, it escalates. It typically starts with like verbal, like name calling and, kind of this kind of nastiness. And then it might be a shove or a slap. And then it ends up to be like a punch or a kick or pinching or hair pulling. Once you open the door, you're always at risk of it increasing. And so, and the earlier you start, the better. And there are better ways for people to start fights than with their to end conflict than with their fists. So I take it pretty seriously when I work with families or when I'm teaching or presenting at conferences. I think it's something to not normalize.
That's really disturbing. And I guess, and as you're talking, I'm thinking you're absolutely right. It is normalized to a large extent. It's kind of expected that children, will fight with their siblings. But yeah, the impact would be the same, right? The impact of a child being hit by their sibling will be the same as being hit by another child, or even worse, perhaps, because it can happen so frequently.
Well, it happens frequently, and you're trapped at home with them, right? There's some people who have written, I'm sorry, I can't remember the citation off the top of my head, but that it's, so the rates of sibling abuse, siblings who are abused by a sibling kids who are abused by a sibling is higher than parental abuse and peer bullying combined. But nobody talks about it because it's so normalized, but it's extremely prevalent. And it's, some have written that it's kind of a double whammy, because not only are you afraid to live in your own home like you would with parent abuse, but it's also you're not being protected by your parent. So it's parental neglect. So it's almost like you're supposed to keep me safe and you're not. And then the person who's making me terrified or terrorizing me lives in my house. Yeah. And, we're talking about in the United States generally around 6 or 7% of that kind of extreme abuse. But, when you take a look at national surveys, it seems higher. I mean, when I say extreme, I mean like the ones that get reported to Child Protective and those kinds of things.
Wow.
You've mentioned factors that contribute to sibling abuse. Hopefully some of those are malleable.
Oh, absolutely. you know, what you had a guest, and I'm sorry, I'm spacing out on names right now, who was talking about favoritism not long ago, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really the number one explanation for a lot of violence in families. That when kids are feeling like, and remember, with favoritism, it's not necessarily that the parents are playing favorites, but the kids perceive that there is favorites. And so when there's this perception that there's an imbalance, then people tend to resent the sibling that's getting the more favored treatment. Or if they're in the more favored position, they may want to keep their position. And so that's something to take seriously too. So, often when kids, say things like, yeah, my brother's your favorite, parents will go like, no, they're not. I love you all the same, like you guys talked about. Or, I treat you all the same, which is an impossibility. And what that does is it continues the same pattern because it dismisses the child's complaint, and parents even get annoyed by it, right? So now the child really feels like, I'm not being heard, I'm annoying my parents. And so it's just more evidence that my brother or sister is in a better position than I am.
I've heard so many kids say, she never gets in trouble.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably not true, but even if 1 out of 10 times little sister gets away with something, it just reinforces the older sibling's belief that she's the favored child. I've heard that idea that it's resentment, it's favoritism that is the fuel for a lot of these conflicts.
Yeah, that would be the biggie. So when you talk about what can you do about it, that would be one thing to address for sure. Another is, which I think you also covered a little bit, and we've talked about already, is this comparison. The more you compare and the more siblings feel compared, the more they often resent, because when you compare, that means there's winners and losers, right? One is better than the other. So you get that too. Other reasons why you have sibling conflict in houses is it's directly linked to marital conflict. So if parents are fighting with each other, you're likely to see more conflict between siblings. Side taking, not just in terms of favoritism, but also just, in terms of like protectiveness, like parents, when this is sort of a catch-22 for parents, because the more you intervene in your siblings' relationships, the more likely they are to fight with each other. And the reason for that is because when parents intervene, they often intervene on one side, one child's side over the other, although they don't always recognize it that way. But when they say things like, you're the older sister, you should know better, or give them the toy, they're little, those kind of things. And so in research, parents do come in often to protect the younger one and from the older one. And then, of course, that makes the older one more resentful and hostile to their sibling. And so, when mom and dad aren't around.
Yeah. I mean, I'm having these sort of moments where I'm reflecting on my own parenting. And I think one of the hardest things I find as a parent is when my children fight and when I think the older one is using their strength against be it strength verbally or be it physically. I mean, they don't often physically get physical, but they do. And I do notice that I'll side with what I perceive as the weaker one in that moment. And I will get angry with the stronger one. And it's really is sort of, it's visceral and it's automatic.
I agree. It's very hard. Parenting is a no-win situation. It really, you get a lot of joy out of it, man, but there's a lot of tough years and a lot of tough moments. And that's one of them. The thing about a lot of parenting, and I think you'll both recognize this in probably other conversations you've had with people and in your own practice and so on, is that parents tend to give a lot of attention to the problem behaviors and not great attention to the good moments. And so, you can have siblings who are playing so nicely with each other and sharing and complimenting and high-fiving and all the good stuff. And parents don't say a word. And then the minute, a fight breaks out, all of a sudden you're like, you two, cut that out. And then, you're being mean to you and you go to your room, and these kind of interventions that only make matters worse. And meanwhile, there's, all this time to be like, I love how you're playing with each other and how you're sharing. And, I'm so happy that you're so nice to each other. That happens in so many areas of parenting, but particularly with siblings, because, and I think parents are just busy. And so, they throw their kids into a room and they're like, now I can wash the dishes or do the laundry or catch up on work or write this paper or whatever they need to do. And then, they're like, good, they're quiet, and they're, and then when it gets too quiet, we get nervous. And then, of course, when they're yelling, we get nervous. But we have to parent even when things are going well.
That's right. That's right. But it is true. It's so hard, because thinking about the beginning of our conversation today, where we don't want violence between our children, we want to intervene. But then when we do intervene, we need to be mindful of how we intervene, because if we do take sides in any way, and sometimes the simple act of intervening is taking sides for the children, or it'll appear like we're taking sides.
There's almost no way to get involved without feeling like they're side taking. Because if there's already a perception that, mom allows more privileges for you than for me, or anything, then even if you play it neutral, the one who feels like you've sided with them all along is going to feel betrayed, right? Like, hey, you're supposed to be, right? And then you're going to have other issues. So, like I said, it's a very hard thing to be a parent. But what I would recommend is, instead of trying to handle things on the fly, is that if there's ongoing conflict or even bickering that's annoying, that you address it prior. That is, you can sit down with your family and come up with rules for, behavioral expectations, and really try to clearly spell them out, and then have them even practice with each other. And then when they come up, you can intervene by saying, do you remember what we talked about, what the rules are? And then give them an opportunity to try those out. And then, of course, if they do well, you praise the hell out of it or reward it. And if they don't, you give them opportunities. And then maybe there's a consequence if you want to incorporate some of those kind of things. But you have to be planful, because a little bit of work on the front end can save you a lot of frustration on the back end. And when we handle things on the fly, we just don't do it well.
Well, and part of that conversation is to just describe the pattern, and to say, I've noticed that when this happens, then this happens, then this happens, and then you're fighting, and to make everybody more aware of, what I call the dance, and so that maybe you can start intervening earlier in the process and say, hey, guys, I'm hearing these words being used, or this tone is starting to emerge. I think you all need to separate, or whatever it may be. So just making people more aware of what they're doing takes out that automatic and habitual aspect of it to some extent.
Yeah, no, I like that strategy.
Well, it really is true. I'm just thinking of previous conversations that parents have such a big part to play in sibling conflict. We do have responsibility.
That's what I have a book that's coming out in the next, 6 months or so. I'm not exactly sure when it's coming out, and it's exactly on this topic. It's for parents on how to manage sibling conflict. And so the thing that I think makes this book different from all the other books on siblings is that, it's more about parenting than it is about the siblings. The focus becomes so much on their behavior when it really needs to be on the behavior of the adults.
Absolutely.
Yeah. The other part of the research on siblings, which is even more compelling to me, is that positive sibling relationships are incredibly powerful. Sibling closeness and warmth, it has protective features, which I'll explain to you some of the research about that in a minute. It's associated with happiness in life. It's associated with better health. It's associated with more academic and career and financial success. It's associated with all kinds of, there's nothing better than a positive sibling relationship. And in fact, this kind of came out of a famous study called the Harvard Men's Study, in which they have been following cohorts of Harvard graduates for many, many years, and even their children and so on. And the number one predictor for happiness in upper middle age, later life, was a close relationship with a sibling. And the researchers, like, how could that be? It was more powerful than marital equality, income, you name it. That was the thing. And in terms of protective features, one of the things that we've seen in multiple studies at this point is that when kids are exposed to harsh environments like, high conflict homes, divorce, those kinds of, rough neighborhoods, that you see that they fall behind on lots of measures in terms of, more behavior problems, academic struggles, and so on, unless they have a good relationship with a sibling. You often don't see those negative effects that it really can buffer from harmful things. And, one of the things I like to suggest to therapists is that, when you're working with a child of a divorcing family, you can and should talk about, the difficulty of coping and the emotions and all those kind of, behaviors they're engaging in. But man, if you can build the sibling relationship and focus on that, it's a very positive way to go, and it has lifelong positive consequences. And so I think, sometimes, like I said before, we like to parent the negative behavior, not the positive. Like, we tend to get drawn into the negative. And that happens in the academic world too, is that we spend a lot of time talking about sibling fighting when I think we should be talking about how to build sibling closeness and warmth and support. And so we don't just want to stop fighting. We want to stop it, but we also want to, build in these ways to connect. And so that would be, I guess, the thing that I always find gets kind of overlooked, and it's like super important.
Super important. And what it sort of reminds me of is something else I wanted to talk about today, but we're running out of time, is the impact of not having siblings. Like, working with only children in the clinic over the years, I've seen many of them have this sort of deep sense of loneliness. And especially if they've had a difficult relationship with their parents, they haven't had a sibling that has validated their perspective, like has said, yeah, mom and dad are being idiots, or has, protected them or stood by them, or, offered them the support that perhaps they weren't getting from parents. So yeah, siblings do have a really important role. And I see it at, the sort of the other side of the coin. When you don't have any siblings, it's lonely and painful.
Yeah, it's so important to have somebody to commiserate with and go, man, isn't dad being a jerk right now? Like, it makes such a difference. I'll give you just this much, and then we can stop, about the research on only children, which is a funny term, by the way, right? And a lot of folks who write about it prefer the term singletons, because only sounds so like pathetic.
Wow, you're right. Very negative.
The research on only children is this: that when they tend to do better than everybody else on so many measures, including academic and career success, financial success, marital happiness, like having some good social relationships. The myth of the outcast only child doesn't really show up in that literature, but there's a huge accept, and that is only if they grow up in low conflict households with happy parents and good relationships. If they grow up in what you just described, conflictual houses, stressful houses, conflictual houses, they do worse than everybody else. So they occupy the ends of the spectrum. Yeah,
that's interesting.
That makes a lot of sense.
Really
but that shows you the power of brothers and sisters, right? You need somebody to commiserate with to kind of keep it like even.
Yeah, but also the impact of a lot of conflict.
The impact of a lot of conflict, yeah. That's important.
And it can go on. I mean, I think, I talk to clients. I work with adults at the moment. I used to work with children and families. And, talking about sibling conflict, talking about parental conflict, it doesn't end, when we move out of the house. It still sort of continues to haunt us.
For another episode, there is discussion that happens in the sibling world that we are much more likely to couple up with a person like our siblings than we are with an opposite sex parent. That this sort of legacy of Freud doesn't necessarily hold up once you start to look at the sibling world. And part of that has to do with that discussion earlier of these complementary halves, that we tend to fill those halves. So that's for another episode.
Amazing.
Oh yeah, partner choice. That's a dirty little secret.
Oh yeah.
All right. Well, we will set that up for later. That will be fun. Well, thank you so much. This has been delightful and very informative. And I do have great relationships with my siblings now. Every Friday we Zoom, all six of us, those that are available. And we've been doing that since the beginning of the pandemic. And we catch up on things and share stories and commiserate and talk about our parents. It's good.
No, it's awesome. And, it'll make you all happier and live longer lives.
Yeah, I expect it will. All right. Dr. John Caspi, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
I can't wait to get hold of your book. Let us know when it's out.
I will. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. A really nice conversation. Thank you for having me on.
Thanks so much for tuning into the Life's Dirty Little Secrets podcast.
If you have any feedback for us or secrets for future episodes, you can email us at lifesdirtylittlesecretspodcast@gmail.com.
Be sure to follow us on Instagram at Life's Dirty Little Secrets or on Facebook at Life's Dirty Little Secrets Podcast.
We invite you to follow, rate, and review us on wherever you listen to this podcast. It is the best way to get our podcast out in front of new listeners.
We'll be back in a couple of weeks with more.
See you then.